PLL.fppradio.com. So there is a Peace Prize nominee who is being chased around the world by a Peace Prize winner. The Peace Prize nominee says, "I would like a fair trial, please." And the Peace Prize winner says, "No fair trial for you." No, that is not a bad joke. That is reality. The reality for Edward Snowden, who is, I have heard that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He is a winner of the FPP Peace Prize, which voting on the 2014 Peace Prize, the 2014 FPP Peace Prize, is going on now until November 4th at peaceprize.fpp.cc. But there's a new interview that was done recently with Edward Snowden. The story written by Megan Wilson over at thehill.com. She writes, former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden tried to negotiate with government officials about being able to stand trial for alleged crimes. That, according to an interview with The New Yorker. Snowden said, quote, "I told the government again and again in negotiations, if they're prepared to offer an open trial, a fair trial, in the same way that Daniel Ellsberg got, and I'm allowed to make a case before a jury, I would love to do so." But they declined. Ellsberg, who released the controversial Pentagon Papers in 1971 that detailed the U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, essentially faced the same set of charges levied against Snowden. Ellsberg wrote in May an op-ed that even though his opportunity to speak at his own trial was limited, it would have been even worse for Snowden, or rather it would be even worse for Snowden. Last June, federal prosecutors charged Snowden with 2 violations under the Espionage Act: unauthorized communication of national defense information and willful communication of classified communications intelligence information to an unauthorized person, in addition to theft charges. Snowden also invoked other recent whistleblowers, including former NSA official Thomas Drake and Private Manning, who leaked materials to the anti-secrecy website WikiLeaks. Snowden said, "In my case, and all the cases in the last decade, we've seen the way the law is being used in whistleblowing cases has changed. You're actually forbidden now from making a public interest defense if you are charged under the Espionage Act." Let me repeat that. You are forbidden from making a public interest defense if you are charged under the Espionage Act. So a public interest defense would be akin to saying, it's in the public's interest to know this information. The American people deserve to know that they are being spied on by the National Security Agency. The American public deserves to know that they might possibly maybe be spied on by the FBI. The American public deserves to know what is going on in Washington, D.C. That defense is no longer allowed. You know, it's in the public interest for the American military to drop bombs on people in the Middle East. That's the defense used by the government all the time when they want to do horrible things. But when you want to reveal the horrible things that they're doing, you're not allowed to use that defense. The article here from The Hill continues. It says Snowden pushed back on criticism from some officials that he could have handled his complaints about the NSA differently. While it appears as if existing law and a section of an Obama administration policy may have protected him for sharing classified information, it does not protect him from retaliation. Thomas Drake, for example, shared documents about waste and abuse with the NSA with inspector generals for his own agency and with the Defense Department, even going to the House and Senate intelligence panels. He was prosecuted on 10 felony charges after ultimately going to a reporter at the Baltimore Sun out of frustration. Quote, there were no proper channels through which I could report these concerns to independent actors who could review it and change things. All of the channels led to the officials who authorized these programs in secret without public consent, end quote, Edward Snowden. He continues, that's a really serious concern because when we think about the way government works in America, the way democracy works in America, and more broadly, liberal societies function around the world, they function on the consent of the governed, and consent is not meaningful if not informed. If officials are making decisions for us behind closed doors, if they're authorizing operations on the decision of secret courts, and they all say, this is okay, this is okay, this is okay, but the minute these issues hit a newspaper, we see something completely different. A massive debate surrounding the American government's surveillance practices after Snowden leaked NSA documents hit the Washington Post and The Guardian last year. When Snowden was asked on Saturday if Mills was angry with him upon their reunion, he chuckled, although the article here does not explain who Mills is. Snowden said, quote, I'll leave that to the investigative journalist. After being prodded, he admitted she was not entirely pleased, saying, quote, but at the same time, it was an incredible reunion. She understood that the mission of leaking the NSA documents meant a lot to me. I'm guessing Mills here is the girlfriend or fiance that he left in Hawaii, but I am not sure. Again, the article doesn't mention who Mills is. The article concludes with a quote from Edward Snowden, although she had a very, very challenging year, and I'll leave it to her to discuss that when and if she's ready. It was a meeting I'll never forget. And there's, you know how sometimes when you're reading an article, something will pop up on the side? More in news. Snowden's girlfriend now lives with him in Moscow. This also another article from thehill.com. But let's talk about one of the things that Edward Snowden said in this interview with the New Yorker that is being reported on in The Hill. He said that the way governments work is with the consent of the governed. And that's the lie that we're told, right? That's the great lie. And I'm going to call it the great lie because that's really what it is. We're told as children going through school, learning about American history, well, the Declaration of Independence says that governments exist with the consent of the governed. So therefore, it must be true because it was written down by one of these people that lived, 250 years ago, and they were so much smarter than us. The Declaration of Independence was basically written by God and handed down to Thomas Jefferson upon Mount Vernon, is essentially what we're told. I know it's not exactly that, but, we're told this, like the founding fathers, they were writing, and essentially they were writing the words of God because they were inspired by God, is the claim. And whether or not they felt inspired by some greater being, I don't know. I wasn't there. I was not that person, so I can't tell you. But to make the claim that governments only exist with the consent of the governed is the great lie. Because there have been poll after survey that show that a vast majority of people do not consent to what is going on in the federal government in the United States of America today. Which means if people don't consent, then the government shouldn't be doing what they're doing. It's a lie to say that governments exist with the consent of the governed. It's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie. I don't consent. Do you? More when we come back. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. online at fppradio.com. You know, I've got a lot of other news that I'm going to get into. But first, I want to make sure that I tell you about a way that you can wind up indirectly funding some of the projects that I do. And that is by going to shop.fppradio.com to begin your online shopping. Whether you're shopping from Amazon or buying some gold and silver from Amagi Metals or looking to register a website with Namecheap, if you just start the shopping at shop.fppradio.com, there's a shopping iframe from Amazon built into the page. There's also a link. And, of course, with Amazon, all orders over $35 get free shipping. There's also links for Coinbase and ExpressCoin, a couple of options for you to purchase Bitcoin. And, of course, you can use Bitcoin at Amagi Metals and Namecheap. And, of course, directly from me there in the Bitcoin store. All of that and more is at shop.fppradio.com. So you may have heard that Twitter has sued the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There's an article from Reuters from earlier in the week that mentions that on Tuesday, Twitter filed that lawsuit against the DOJ, and after looking at the actual filing, they also filed the lawsuit against the FBI, and the lawsuit intensifies the battle with the federal agencies as the internet industry's self-described champion of free speech seeks the right to reveal the extent of U.S. government surveillance. The lawsuit, which Twitter said follows months of fruitless negotiations with the government, marks an escalation in the internet industry's battle over government gag orders on the nature and number of requests for private user information. In the lawsuit filed in U.S. District Court in Northern California, Twitter said that current rules prevent it from even stating that it has not received any national security request for user information. Now, there are questions about whether or not one can use a warrant canary, as it's called. For example, there's a radio program called The Freedom Fiends, which if you're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio live on Sunday on the Liberty Radio Network, which is the network that the show originates on, it, of course, is picked up from a couple, or rather on a couple of other networks, such as Daily Paul Radio and Freedom Phalanx Radio. But on LRN, the Freedom Fiends have their show immediately before Peace, Love, Liberty Radio goes on the air. And their warrant canary is the word worms. So if they stop saying worms, or instead of saying worms, they start saying word, then you know that they've been slapped with some sort of request or national security letter or FISA court order of some sort. That is their warrant canary. Apple, for instance, had a warrant canary in their transparency reports, and apparently their warrant canary disappeared from the most recent transparency report. Whether or not that means that they've been slapped with some of these court orders or letters, nobody really knows because, well, there's a gag order attached to the court order and the national security letter, which means that if you get hit with one of these things, you can't tell anybody, hey, we got one of these letters. And it's arguable whether or not it's even legal to use a warrant canary. So essentially, the federal court is going to wind up deciding whether or not it's legal to use a warrant canary. The article here from Reuters continues, though. It says, the messaging service said such restrictions violate the Constitution's First Amendment guarantee of free speech. Twitter posted in a blog post, This is an important issue for anyone who believes in a strong First Amendment, and we hope to be able to share our complete transparency report. Tech companies have sought to clarify their relationship with U.S. law enforcement and spying agencies in the wake of revelations by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden. Twitter's lawsuit follows an agreement between internet companies like Google and Microsoft with the government about the court orders they receive related to surveillance. The agreement freed the companies to disclose the number of orders they received, but only in broad ranges. A company that offers email service, for example, would be able to say that it received between 0 and 999 orders from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court during a 6-month period for email content belonging to someone outside the United States. In a separate case, a federal appeals court in San Francisco this past week, it says that on Wednesday they will hear, but this happened a few days ago. So a federal appeals court in San Francisco heard arguments on whether the FBI gag receipts of national security letters, or whether the FBI can gag recipients of national security letters. A lower court judge had ruled that those security guidelines were unconstitutional. The article here from Reuters continues. It says Twitter, which allows its 271 million monthly users to send 140-character text messages, has traditionally taken an aggressive posture challenging government censorship requests and has previously described itself as the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party. The American Civil Liberties Union praised Twitter's actions, saying in a statement that the company was doing right by challenging this tangled web of secrecy rules and gag orders. Twitter said in its complaint, and of course this is not the full complaint, this is only in part, the U.S. government has taken the position that service providers like Twitter are even prohibited from saying that they have received 0 national security requests or 0 of a particular type of national security request. The Justice Department responded to the lawsuit with a statement on how it worked with other companies. Justice Department spokeswoman Emily Pierce said, earlier this year, the government addressed similar concerns raised in a lawsuit brought by several major tech companies. There, the parties worked collaboratively to allow tech companies to provide broad information on government requests while also protecting national security. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is an organization that I do donate funds to on an occasional basis, defends civil liberties in the digital world and said that it is disappointed that tech companies have given up the fight. Nate Cardoza, a staff attorney with the group, said EFF and a number of privacy and free speech organizations expressed our profound disappointment that the companies dropped their lawsuit for so little. There's more on the lawsuit from Twitter against the DOJ and the FBI. And, of course, find out more about warrant canaries when we come back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. So the article here from Reuters that I've been reading, where it gives a little bit of information about the lawsuit filed by Twitter against the DOJ and the FBI. It continues and says the government's restriction on providing more details about requests for user data are useful for one thing, which is to keep the public in the dark about what authorities the government uses to get our data. Twitter's lawsuit said the company has discussed the matter with the government for months. In a meeting with officials from the DOJ and the FBI in January, Twitter argued that it should not be bound by the disclosure limits that the government offered to Google and other companies, mainly because Twitter was not involved in those discussions. But nonetheless, the government wants to bind Twitter to an agreement that they never made. The company said it submitted a draft transparency report with more detailed data to the FBI in April, but the agency denied Twitter's request to publish the draft 5 months later. The blog post from Twitter says, "We've tried to achieve the level of transparency our users deserve without litigation, but to no avail." It said that it was asking the court to declare these restrictions on our ability to speak about government surveillance as unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So again, it seems as though the case is over whether or not one can use a warrant canary. And if you do use a warrant canary, whether after you've been served with one of these orders or national security letters, whether you can then remove the warrant canary. Because if you can't remove the warrant canary, then essentially the feds or some agency thereof are attempting to compel you to state a lie. Because that's really what it is. If you have a statement that says, "I have never been contacted by the FBI with a request for information about the users of my website," and then the FBI gives you one of these letters, or the DOJ or some other government agency hands you a letter, and then it's no longer true that you have not been contacted about information, and then you attempt to remove that from your website, and they say, "Hey, no, you can't remove that because you can't tell people that you have been contacted." And the defense is, "Well, I'm not saying I've been contacted. I'm just letting people know that it's no longer true that I've not been contacted." Well, you can't do that either. So essentially, it appears that the federal government is attempting to either compel speech or to compel untrue speech. In either case, I think that it is wrong, both morally and legally, and I don't think that there's any justification whatsoever for the feds to compel speech one way or another. But I guess the real question here is about the actual use of warrant canaries and what exactly is a warrant canary. There's a definition from the Electronic Frontier Foundation that says a warrant canary is a colloquial term for a regularly published statement that a service provider has not received legal process that it would be prohibited from saying it had received. Once a service provider does receive legal process, the speech prohibition goes into place and the canary statement is removed, thereby informing the public that the process has been received. And again, I had mentioned that Apple had their own warrant canary, and that canary appears to be dead, which would lead one to believe that Apple has been contacted in some manner about user information. But it's not just tech companies that have to worry about getting these national security letters or some of these Section 215 warrants, as they're called. Section 215, of course, being a reference to the USA Patriot Act. There have also been librarians and journalists who have been targeted and received some of these letters and orders. So I do think that, whether or not it is ultimately legal to use a warrant canary, nobody really knows. At this moment, it is going to ultimately be up to a federal court to decide. This case, of course, filed in the U.S. District Court in the northern section of California, which ultimately will wind up, I believe, going to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And from there, it may or may not go to the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm not really sure. I don't know. If Twitter is successful in the lower court, maybe the feds will wind up appealing to the Supreme Court. If Twitter winds up losing in the lower court, maybe they'll have to wind up, doing one of these sort of cost-benefit analysis sort of things and say, can we justify spending all of this extra money to go to the next level of court to stand on principle. And I don't really know what I would do if I were in that position. Of course, Twitter's a multi-million-dollar company, so they have a lot more to throw around than I do. But I don't know. I certainly applaud Twitter for trying to stand up for free speech and trying to do what they can to protect their users' data. But aside from that, and I understand, because I use Twitter, so I understand, it's good for sharing links. It's good for sending out short messages of there's this event at this time at this location. But other than that, as far as a social network goes, I don't think Twitter is a good social network. And here's the reason that I say that. Have you ever tried having an intellectual conversation 140 characters at a time? It's not easy, especially when about 15 or 20 of those characters are taken up with the @ sign and the username of the person that you're trying to have a conversation with. It's not easy having a well thought out discussion roughly 120 characters at a time. So as far as social networks go, I don't think that Twitter is a good social network, but it is certainly useful. And I applaud the company for doing what they can to try to protect user information and to try to let people know whether or not they've been contacted by the feds. And if they have, to give some kind of narrower range of between 0 and 999 requests. That could be 2, that could be 999. There's a large gap there. I would still think that it would be a little insane to tell Twitter or any other tech company, you can say you had between 100 and 300 requests. That's still a very broad range, but that would be better than saying between 0 and 999. But I don't know. The whole thing is odd, and I hope that Twitter is successful, and hopefully other companies that wind up doing sort of social networking sort of things will wind up filing lawsuits against the feds. Not because I want there to be more lawsuits, but just because I would like to know that there are more companies that are actually concerned about protecting user data. And hopefully, in the end, Twitter comes out successful in the courts. Although I'm not going to hold my breath, because essentially you're going to the judicial branch of the government that is trying to oppress you and saying, hey, please tell your friend over here to be nicer to me. I don't know. But speaking of court, there's more. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. I teased that you should stay tuned because there's more about court. This court that I am talking about is the Ross Ulbricht court. Actually, it's not his court, but it's the court in which Ross Ulbricht will be facing charges next month. There's some news. Some new news about the Ross Ulbricht trial that I will get to momentarily. But first, I want to make sure that I tell you about Coinbase. I had mentioned Coinbase when I was telling you about the various places that you can shop from shop.fppradio.com. Coinbase is one of them. Coinbase is not just a Bitcoin wallet. They also have Bitcoin vaults where you can put the money and then it's essentially stored offline. And, I highly recommend that you have some of your Bitcoin, if not the majority of your Bitcoin, stored offline, because offline makes it harder for someone to hack. But Coinbase also has merchant services. So if you have a small business, or even if you have a large business like Overstock.com uses Coinbase, but there's about 30,000 businesses that use Coinbase to process their Bitcoin payments. And the reason that I mentioned small business is because, a lot of people listening, I don't really expect the CEO of a major corporation to be listening to the show. But, hey, if the CEO of Walmart's listening, yeah, Coinbase. Like, I would love to use Bitcoin at Walmart. It would just make it so much simpler instead of some cashier that doesn't really know what they're doing. Like, let me go through the self-check, scan all my stuff, Bitcoin, done, I'm gone. But Coinbase has these merchant services to where you can, put up the little payment widget on your website and people scan and boop, it's good. And the best thing about the merchant services from Coinbase is that on the first $1 million worth of transactions that Coinbase processes for you, there's no transaction fee. The only time you pay a fee for Coinbase is either when you buy or sell Bitcoin. So if you want to convert your Bitcoin to cash, you can press a couple of buttons, and then Coinbase will wind up sending money into your bank account, and they then take ownership of the Bitcoin. Then the fee is 1% plus a 15-cent bank fee. You cannot get rid of the 15-cent bank fee because that's something that's charged by the bank or the credit union. But 1%, like, you cannot beat a 1% fee. Same thing if you buy Bitcoin. You send Coinbase some money from your bank account, they give you Bitcoin, 1% plus a 15-cent bank fee. I can't think of really any better quote on Bitcoin prices anywhere. Coinbase.fppradio.com. Get started. Use their merchant services. And if you go through that affiliate link, then, after you do $100 worth of business, they send me a little something as a thank you for sending them new customers. So Coinbase.fppradio.com. Bitcoin, of course, that's what you buy and transact there at Coinbase. Bitcoin is the thing that the Silk Road was accepting as forms of payment, and the alleged operator of the Silk Road was Ross Ulbricht, who, again, you heard me mention the FPP Peace Prize earlier. Ross Ulbricht is a nominee for the 2014 FPP Peace Prize. You can vote at peaceprize.fpp.cc. So the article here from Wired, and this is from a few days ago, and if there's time, there, of course, is a scheduled guest next hour, but if something happens and that scheduled guest isn't on, then I will be able to give you the new updates. But there's news here from a few days ago from Wired that says, with only a month until the scheduled trial of Ross Ulbricht, the alleged creator of the Silk Road drug site, Silk Road, Ulbricht's somehow I misread that entire sentence, and it made no sense in my brain. So let me reread that. With only a month until the scheduled trial of Ross Ulbricht, the alleged creator of the Silk Road drug site, Ulbricht's defense lawyers have zeroed in on the argument that the U.S. government illegally hacked the billion-dollar black market site to expose the location of its hidden server. The prosecution's latest rebuttal to that argument takes an unexpected tack. They claim that even if the FBI did hack the Silk Road without a warrant, and prosecutors are careful not to admit that they did, that intrusion would be a perfectly law-abiding act of criminal investigation. This past Monday, the prosecutors submitted the latest in a series of combative court filings from the two sides of the Silk Road case that have clashed over Ulbricht's Fourth Amendment right to privacy. The government's new argument responds to an affidavit from an expert witness, tech lawyer Joshua Horowitz, brought in by Ulbricht's defense to poke holes in the FBI story of how it located the Silk Road server. In a letter filed last week, Horowitz called out inconsistencies in the FBI's account of stumbling across the Silk Road's IP address while innocently entering miscellaneous data into the login page. He testified that the FBI's actions instead sound more like common hacker intrusion techniques. Ulbricht's defense has called for an evidentiary hearing to cross-examine the FBI about the operation. In the government's rebuttal, however, Ulbricht's prosecutors don't directly contest Horowitz's description of the FBI investigation, though they do criticize his testimony in passing as factually and analytically flawed in a number of respects. Instead, they obliquely argue that the foreign location of its site's server and its reputation as a criminal haven meant that Ulbricht's Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches don't apply, even if the FBI did use hacking techniques to penetrate the Silk Road and did so without a warrant. The prosecutor's new memo reads, quote, "Even if the FBI somehow hacked into the Silk Road server in order to identify its IP address, such an investigative measure would not have run afoul of the Fourth Amendment. Given that the Silk Road server was hosting a blatantly criminal website, it would have been reasonable for the FBI to hack into it in order to search it, and any such hack would simply have constituted a search of foreign property known to contain criminal evidence for which a warrant was not necessary. The Silk Road server in question, after all, was located not in the United States, but in a data center near Reykjavik, Iceland, and though Ulbricht is an American citizen, the prosecutors argue that the server's location abroad made it fair game for remote intrusion. Quote, "Because the Silk Road server was located outside the United States, the Fourth Amendment would not have required a warrant to search the server, whether for its IP address or otherwise," according to the prosecutor's filing. In a footnote, the memo adds another strike against Ulbricht's Fourth Amendment protections. The Silk Road was not only hosted in a foreign data center, but also rented from a third-party web hosting service, and because Ulbricht allegedly violated the company's terms of service by using its computers to deal narcotics and other contraband, the company was exempted from any obligation to protect his privacy. Finally, prosecutors argue that the 30-year-old Texan to claim, or rather, that for the 30-year-old Texan to claim privacy protections for Silk Road server, he would have to declare that it belonged to him. A tricky catch-22. Ulbricht has not claimed personal possession of that computer's data, as doing so would almost certainly incriminate him. But because he has not, he can't claim that his privacy was violated when it was searched, according to the prosecutor's reasoning. Because Ulbricht has not submitted any affidavit alleging that he had any possessory interest in the server, let alone one that would give him a reasonable expectation of privacy, his motion should be denied, read the filing. Early on Tuesday, Judge Catherine Forrest ordered Ulbricht's defense to decide within the day whether it will argue that Ulbricht did have an expectation of privacy for the server, as well as all of his other seized computers and online accounts. She's given him until the end of Wednesday to make that argument, and she did wind up issuing a ruling, and I might give you that ruling during the next hour of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. But whether you get that decision or not depends upon whether or not my scheduled guest calls in as scheduled. Heck, I might even just throw it in at the beginning of the interview just to make sure that you do wind up finding out what happened with the allegation of hacking by the FBI. Stay tuned. This is Peace, Love, Liberty. Hi, I'm Darryl W. Perry, and I need your help to take Peace, Love, Liberty Radio on the road. In the spirit of Motorhome Diaries and Liberty on Tour, I intend to take the message of peace, love, and liberty on the road. I intend to leave New Hampshire at the conclusion of the New Hampshire Liberty Forum and return at the beginning of PorcFest. During the 104-day trip, I'll be visiting at least 10 cities across the country, speaking to people about the ideas of peace, love, and liberty, while continuing to produce daily Liberty media. Pensacola, Florida, Austin, Texas, Sedona, Arizona, and Denver, Colorado are already on the map. If you have a college group, a local Liberty on the Rocks, or other Liberty meetup that you'd like me to visit, you can possibly add your event to my calendar. To find out more about the tour or to donate, visit tour.fppradio.com. That's tour.fppradio.com. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. And yes, this is hour number 2, which normally means interview hour, but as I kind of suspected going into the show today, my guest that I had lined up is not going to be on. There has not been a call, and the last email exchange has been about a week ago. Normally, I'll exchange emails a couple of days beforehand just to, remind the person, hey, you're coming on the show, and they'll respond, oh, yes, thank you, I've got it. But I've not received any correspondence, so I don't know what is going on with the guest, but I sincerely hope that everything is okay. But that does mean that I get to tell you more about the Ross Ulbricht case. You may recall during the last segment of the last hour, I was telling you about the motion that was filed by the attorneys for Ross Ulbricht alleging a Fourth Amendment violation because of the hacking of the Silk Road server, or the alleged hacking of the Silk Road server by the FBI. And, of course, the FBI doesn't deny that what they did looks a lot like hacking. However, the FBI is claiming that, well, it doesn't really matter because it was in Iceland and we can do what we want. Ha, ha, ha. Well, there's a little bit more to the first article that I am reading before I get into telling you what the judge said. And both articles are from Wired. Both articles will be linked to on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. The first article continues. It says, the pretrial motion over which Ulbricht's defense lawyers and the prosecution have been sparring for the last 2 months don't directly seek to have the central narcotics conspiracy and money laundering charges against Ulbricht dismissed. Instead, his lawyers have sought to prove that the evidence gathered by the law enforcement is tainted. If the initial pinpointing of Silk Road server was illegal, they argue, practically all of the evidence from the resulting investigation could be rendered inadmissible. Earlier in the month, the government responded to that motion with an affidavit from former FBI agent Christopher Tarbell describing how the Silk Road server was first found. As he described it, a misconfiguration of the anonymity software Tor allowed the site's login page to leak its IP address. But the technical experts in the security and privacy community immediately expressed deep skepticism of that account. And last week, Ulbricht's defense responded with a list of inconsistencies in Tarbell's affidavit, as well as new accusations that the FBI had violated the hacking law known as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Ulbricht's attorneys compared the FBI's actions to those of Andrew Weave Arnheimer, who was convicted in 2012 of conspiracy to violate the CFAA when he and a friend collected more than 100,000 iPad user email addresses from an insecure AT&T website. While the prosecution's latest filings don't dwell on the facts of Tarbell's story, it does point out that the CFAA hacking law has an exemption for the law enforcement, as do pretty much all of the laws and statutes and regulations. There's always an exemption for law enforcement. And in some cases, those exemptions make sense. For instance, and I realize that, I'm going to lose some of my voluntarist cred or my libertarian cred for saying that some of the exemptions make sense. But let me explain. For instance, in New Hampshire, it is illegal to possess metallic knuckles, i.e. brass knuckles, unless you have a valid fishing license and are fishing, with the exception of law enforcement and government officials. And the reason is not because they want cops to, wear brass knuckles to beat the crap out of people, but if someone is arrested for possessing brass knuckles, then those need to be taken into evidence to be presented at trial. And, well, it would really be difficult to take those into evidence if the police officer that was, seizing those as evidence wound up getting arrested for violating the same statute. So in that case, it makes sense. I'm not saying that, possessing brass knuckles should be illegal. All I'm saying is that, you shouldn't really arrest the cop that arrested the guy for having brass knuckles because he's trying to put something in the evidence locker. That's all I'm saying. So in certain circumstances, the exemptions for law enforcement make sense. In the case of being able to hack into computers, no, that exemption for law enforcement absolutely 120 billion% does not make sense. Not in the slightest. The article here from Wired continues. It says, it also takes issues with the defense's definition of hacking. In the defense's Arnheimer example, the government argues the hacker in question impersonated AT&T users to gain access to non-public information. Never mind that the email addresses in Arnheimer's case were visible to anyone who typed in a specific URL into his or her browser. The FBI's Tarbell, by contrast, only accessed public data on the Silk Road, according to the prosecution. Their letter reads, the Tarbell Declaration does not describe any such impersonation of Silk Road users to gain access to their information on the server. It describes former agent Tarbell's close examination of traffic data reviewed from the Silk Road website when he used a part of it that was fully accessible to the public at large, the login interface, and received error messages that were accessible to any user who entered erroneous login information. And, of course, to enter erroneous login information, one must be presenting themselves as a user of the Silk Road or a registered user of the Silk Road. So the contradiction here is, or not the contradiction, but the hypocrisy here is just astronomical. And I don't see how the government doesn't see that they are being hypocritical. But they are, and they don't see it. The article here from Wired continues. It says, regardless of whether the government calls it hacking or a mere warrantless search, however, prosecutors' arguments against Ulbricht's Fourth Amendment prosecution, or rather against his protections, aren't particularly convincing, according to Jennifer Granick, director of civil liberties at Stanford Law for the Stanford Law School's Center for Internet and Society. In the case of the prosecution's argument that Ulbricht would need to declare his ownership of the server to claim any right to the privacy of its data, she points out that Ulbricht could also claim a right to privacy as a mere user of the site. She says he doesn't have to own the server. Even if he's just communicating on the server, he already has a reasonable expectation of privacy. As for the government's argument that any foreign server containing an American's data can be searched without a warrant, Granick said that notion remains legally unproven at best. Quote, this is not an obvious open or open-shut argument at all. Overseas searches that target Americans still have to be reasonable. If the target is a U.S. person and it's a U.S. agent looking for information, the Fourth Amendment still applies. So now, there's just a little bit more to this first article about the allegations that the feds had actually hacked into the server. But let me now go to the second article, which is the most recent one that was published on Friday. The title, I will not read, but I will read the first paragraph because the title gives it away. The first paragraph, not so much. Lawyers for Ross Ulbricht have spent the last 2 months shifting the focus from their client to the FBI to the potential illegality of the FBI's investigation. Now the judge has spoken, and it's clear she intends to put Ulbricht, not the FBI, on trial. Her ruling when we come back on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. The article here from Wired is about the judge's ruling in the motion to suppress evidence for the Ross Ulbricht case, where Ross Ulbricht and his attorneys were alleging that some of the evidence against him was illegal and should be thrown out because the feds hacked into the server or hacked the Silk Road website to find the location of the server. The FBI says it doesn't matter if we hacked it or not, although we're saying we didn't hack it, even though everything we did is very similar to hacking. We didn't actually hack it, but it doesn't really matter because we're the feds and we can do whatever we want to, and besides, it was in Iceland, so therefore no Constitution. The ruling on Friday, it was a 38-page ruling by Judge Catherine Forrest. She dismissed the motion to suppress evidence that hinged on the argument that the law enforcement had violated Ross Ulbricht's Fourth Amendment right to privacy from unreasonable searches without a warrant. Let me go off on one of my pet peeves here for a second, to when people only say unreasonable search. Oh, well, I'm protected from unreasonable search. Well, actually, I have the Fourth Amendment in front of me on one of those little metal Bill of Rights things that you're supposed to put in your bag, and then when you go through security, then it goes beep, 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 and then the little tyrant that is searching your bag at the airport pulls it out, and then they're supposed to see, oh, it's the Bill of Rights, ha, 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 you got me. So Amendment 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. So it's not just unreasonable searches, it's unreasonable searches or reasonable searches without a warrant. The key thing is a warrant. You're supposed to have this stupid little piece of paper signed by one of your buddies in a black moo-moo, because that's really what it is, right? A warrant is where one guy from the government goes to another guy from the government and says, hey, I want to go spy on somebody. And then the other guy from the government that wears the black moo-moo says, no, okay, and then signs a little piece of paper, giving the first guy the right to do pretty much whatever he wants, as long as it's written down on the piece of paper of, I want to go spy on whatever I needs to check your butthole. That's basically what it is. Like the TSA could come into your house right now and give you a colonoscopy if they have a piece of paper from some government guy in a moo-moo saying we need to give you a colonoscopy. And it would hold up in court because, well, there's a warrant. Doesn't matter if it's unreasonable, there's a warrant. So let me calm down and continue reading the article. The article continues. It says, just last week, Ulbricht's lawyers went so far as to contend that the FBI had illegally hacked a Silk Road server in Iceland without a warrant to determine its location. But the judge's rejection of that argument comes down to what may be seen as a fateful technicality. She argues that even if the FBI did hack the Silk Road server, Ulbricht had not sufficiently demonstrated that the server belonged to him, and thus can't claim that his privacy rights were violated by its search. She wrote, defendant has brought what he must certainly understand is a fatally deficient motion to suppress evidence. he has failed to take one step he needed to allow the court to consider his substantive claim regarding the investigation. He has failed to submit anything establishing that he has a personal privacy interest in the Icelandic server or any of the other items imaged and or searched and or seized. So because let me read just one more sentence here, and then I will give you my thoughts. The argument may seem like a catch-22. So because Ross Ulbricht did not say, oh, yes, that server belongs to me, he cannot then have the evidence suppressed, which makes it seem to a reasonable person that doesn't, fully understand all of the weird, kooky customs of courtery, that the judge here is basically saying, Ross Ulbricht, you must admit you're guilty in order for me to say that this evidence against you was illegally found. Are you guilty? And of course he's going to say, no, that's why I want a trial. And she's going to say, then, okay, every piece of evidence can be brought forth because you didn't say you're guilty. If you would only say you're guilty, then we could throw out some of this evidence. But the thing is, if Ross Ulbricht is actually innocent, and I'm hoping either that he is, or even if he's not, he's a political prisoner nonetheless. I'll just go ahead and throw that out there. Ross Ulbricht is a political prisoner. But if Ross Ulbricht is not the guy that was behind the Silk Road, then all of this evidence is essentially circumstantial, and there would not be any charge against Ross Ulbricht had there not been this hacking of the Silk Road site. So had they not gone about getting all of this evidence to then wind up, throwing charges at Ross Ulbricht, then none of this would happen. But the judge is saying it doesn't matter. You just need to admit that you're guilty, and then we can look into whether or not any of the evidence was collected illegally. But had none of the evidence been collected, Ross Ulbricht would not be in a courtroom right now. Ross Ulbricht would not be in a jail cell waiting to go into a courtroom right now, because I realize it's Sunday, court isn't open on Sunday, but he would not be in this situation had the feds not illegally gotten evidence. And for the judge to say, well, you have to claim that you're guilty in order for me to wind up looking to see if you're innocent. It sounds a lot like the Nancy Pelosi, we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it sort of thing. Although on that one, there's actually an explanation, and I'm not defending Nancy Pelosi one bit. I think that Nancy Pelosi needs to take a long walk off a short bridge or a short walk off a long bridge, whatever the statement is, she needs to go away. But when she said, we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it, she wasn't lying, because if you actually try to read a bunch of these really long federal legislation proposals, then you will find out that, there's no way to really know what it's going to do, because a lot of times it will say, as directed by the Secretary of fill in the blank. And with the case of the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, which is the bill that Nancy Pelosi was talking about, you actually did have to pass it to find out what was going to happen, because a lot of the sections said, as directed by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So there were things that had not yet been written into law or written into proposal that would become law, because the PPACA said that the Secretary of Health and Human Services gets to write whatever they want. So that's why you have to pass it to find out what's in it. You have to admit you're guilty for us to figure out if you're not. There's more from that when we come back on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. There's more from Wired about the Ross Ulbricht case, where the judge has, what seems to me, said, you must admit you're guilty before I can decide if you're innocent. there's more on that case when we, in just a second. But first, I want to make sure that I tell you about Roberts and Roberts Brokerage. Since 1977, Roberts and Roberts Brokerage has been a trusted source for buying and selling your investment-grade precious metals. They now take Bitcoin for purchasing precious metals so that you can turn some of your profits into a long-term investment. Give Roberts and Roberts Brokerage a call for some knowledgeable advice on investing. 800-874-9760. That's 800-874-9760. So the article here from Wired continues. It says it may sound like a catch-22. If Ulbricht were to claim ownership of the server, he would seem to incriminate himself. But the judge in the case writes that Ulbricht could have nonetheless claimed the server in a pretrial statement that could not be used against him as evidence. Quote, defendant could have established such a personal privacy interest by submitting a sworn statement that could not be offered against him at trial as evidence of his guilt, though it could be used to impeach him should he take the witness stand. Yet he has chosen not to do so. Ulbricht's defense lawyers did not immediately respond to a request for comment. So, based on what I'm reading here, let me go ahead and say this right now. I claim everything on the internet as somehow possibly having a privacy interest for the sake of my privacy should any kind of lawsuit ever something. Is that how this works? So basically, all I have to do is write something down that says that, I have a privacy interest in every server that the internet is hosted on and every computer that the Bitcoin blockchain is being run on and every satellite in space because I use networking and something, they're all connected. Like, that then protects me from any sort of search and seizure? I don't think that's really how it works, but, hey, it's worth a shot, right? The article here continues. It says, the decision by the judge follows a lengthy pretrial debate that came to center around the mysterious events that led the FBI to Ulbricht's alleged Icelandic server. And it's also alleged that it's Ulbricht's server that was in Iceland, although I think that's what they're trying to say, but they've got some words that just seem out of place for that. In early August, Ulbricht's defense lawyers filed a motion to suppress all evidence in the case that they argued had resulted from the potentially illegal search of the computer Ulbricht allegedly rented in a Reykjavik data center to host the Silk Road. If successful, the move would have likely made Ulbricht nearly impossible to convict on the central charges of narcotics and money laundering conspiracy that he faces. The prosecution, however, responded with an affidavit from the FBI that described how it found the server. According to the Bureau, an agent simply entered miscellaneous characters into the login screen until a misconfiguration in the anonymity software Tor leaked the site's IP address. The security community and an expert witness for Ulbricht's defense quickly began to find major inconsistencies in that story. They argued instead that the FBI's account sounded like a thinly veiled intrusion using common hacker techniques. The defense called for a hearing to cross-examine the FBI, but the prosecution's final response to that argument barely addressed its hacking accusations. Instead, the Justice Department lawyers told the judge that it did not matter whether the Silk Road was hacked. Even if FBI agents had remotely broken into the Silk Road without a warrant, that would be perfectly legal, according to the government filing. They pointed to the foreign location of the server and its ownership by a third-party web host. Several of those arguments had serious weaknesses, and I had actually reported some of these earlier, and the article here from Wired just reiterates a couple of those. And they continue, it says, in its final jab at the prosecution, the defense had argued that the Department of Justice was trying to excuse a kind of warrantless hacking that would be considered illegal in any other context. Quote, the government posits two standards of behavior. One for private citizens who must adhere to a strict standard of conduct construed by the government, read a final filing on Tuesday. The other for the government, which, with its elastic ability to effect electronic intrusion, can deliberately, cavalierly, and unrepentantly transgress those same standards. But in Friday's ruling, that entire discussion has been declared moot because Ulbricht hasn't sufficiently claimed that the computer belonged to him. According to the judge, saying that any arguments over the FBI's pinpointing of that server, whether through hacking or a more accepted search technique, can't be seen as a privacy violation. She wrote, in short, quote, in short, despite defendant's assertions that the potential issues he and his counsel raise regarding the investigation that led to the Icelandic server, he has not provided the court with the minimal legal basis necessary to pursue those assertions. The FBI's ability to hack any website website abroad without a warrant has never been established in court. Let me read that sentence again and let it sink in, because this is basically what the feds are relying on. They're saying that we can hack any computer anywhere in the world because we're the feds and that computer's over there and no constitution. The article here from Wired says the FBI's ability to hack any website abroad without a warrant has never been established in court. So the FBI and the Department of Justice have essentially granted themselves in this court filing a right that they have never been declared to have had. That no court ever has upheld this supposed right. And, well, it hasn't really been upheld here because the judge says doesn't matter because he didn't say he owned it. The article here continues. It says, the ruling by Forrest comes as a blow not only to Ulbricht, but also to others in the privacy community for whom the defense's motions could have set important precedents. After all, the prosecution in the case had argued that the FBI can, more or less, legally hack any website in the world without a warrant. Stanford Law's Granick, who I had mentioned earlier, said, quote, overseas searches that target Americans still have to be reasonable. If the target is a U.S. person and is a U.S. agent looking for information, the Fourth Amendment still applies. That argument and the other questions surrounding the FBI's murking investigation at least merited a hearing, she argued. Quote, I do think that the defendant has alleged sufficiently that his communications flowing over this system are protected by the Fourth Amendment, such that the government should have to explain why their investigations did not cross that line. Now, that hearing will never happen. Instead, the next time the public will learn more about the FBI Silk Road investigation will likely be next month at the trial of Ross Ulbricht. And it's something that I'm going to keep an eye on. Hell, I'm going to keep both eyes on it and an ear, because it is something that really, it does affect all of us. Because they're alleging that Ross Ulbricht was doing money laundering because people were buying and selling Bitcoin. And, well, a bunch of people use Bitcoin. So how many Bitcoin can be bought and sold before it's considered money laundering? And, hell, the IRS says it's not money, it's property. So how can you launder something that's not money? Still to be seen. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. So, changing gears just a little bit, still not really a whole lot, because it's still another lawsuit, and one that I actually find to be very interesting for a number of reasons. There was a lawsuit filed about a week ago by a group of former college football and basketball players. They filed an antitrust lawsuit against a large array of broadcasters, college sports conferences, multimedia, and marketing rights companies, alleging that the defendants have illegally used their names, images, and likenesses in television and radio broadcast. On the surface, just, after reading that introductory statement right there about the lawsuit, it sounds as though this is some kind of intellectual property sort of thing, but it gets weirder because it's not just that the athletes are saying, well, I know that I was playing quarterback at the University of Tennessee or whatever it was. Down at the bottom of the article, it says exactly who the players were and what they did and where. But let's just think about this logically for a second, that there are athletes that go to college and they get scholarships to play sports, and in return for playing sports they get a free education, and they know that people are going to wind up paying money to go watch them play sports, because that's what happens in college athletics, right? Is there's football teams that people go pay money and they sit in the stands and they watch the games and they cheer, and some people get drunk and some people paint their face. But, nonetheless, people are exchanging money in exchange for watching a game. And somebody has to play that game because, I have never seen an arena or a baseball stadium or a football stadium fill up to where people just pretend to be watching a game. That doesn't happen. So somebody has to be out on the field or the court actually doing the thing. And that's where the college athlete comes in this instance, because this is about college athletes. This isn't about professional athletes and Tom Brady or anything else. College athletes. So the college athletes are going to school, and in return for getting the free education, they go play sports. And for the school to make money to reimburse that kid's education, people pay them money to watch the kid play. And all college athletes know that this is happening. Like, if somebody is going to college on a sports scholarship and they don't understand the economics of, people pay money to watch a football game, then they need to go back to kindergarten and really learn some stuff. But anyway, let me just get into the article here, because what's going on in my head might not really be translating well to making sense. The article here from USA Today says the defendants include nearly all of the national over-the-air and cable television networks that have significant live sports college sports programming, the 5 power conferences, and the nation's 2 largest college sports multimedia and marketing rights companies. The suit, which seeks to become a class action suit, was filed in U.S. District Court in Nashville. The case follows several others that have centered on the use of college athletes' names and likenesses, but this is the first one to include television networks as defendants. The plaintiffs allege that the NCAA name and likeness waiver form, which college athletes had been asked to sign until the association eliminated that at the beginning of this school year, is invalid or otherwise unenforceable. Athletes who signed the release had granted permission for the NCAA or an associated third party, such as a school or conference, to use his or her name and picture to promote the NCAA championships or other events without being compensated. So that right there, that fills in a lot of information that I think I was trying to relay, to where college athletes, they're signing papers like sign this thing and it says that you'll play sports for us. Sign this one, it says that we'll give you a free tuition to the school. We'll put you up in a dorm and we'll feed you. Sign this one, it says that you agree to let us, put your name on the back of the jersey, take a picture of you, put it in the program, air your stuff on ESPN or whatever other network. And I don't think anybody going to college on a scholarship for playing sports would be wise to say, no, I'm not going to sign this, because then that would essentially mean that they would have to, either not air any of the games that your school participated in, or find a way to put like a big pixelated thing over top of you whenever you're actually on the field. So it makes no sense to not sign that waiver. So I can understand is it a coerced form? Not really, because no one's forcing you to play sports in exchange for an education. And, so let's just continue the article here. There's not much more to the article, but the article does say the form became an issue in the Ed O'Bannon antitrust lawsuit against the NCAA, which involved colleges' use of athletes' names, images, and likeness in ways including live television broadcast. NCAA officials maintained that athletes were not required to sign the form, but at least 2 college officials testified in the case that they believed that the forms were mandatory. Citing an email from the NCAA director of academic and membership affairs, Chris Richardson, the Big East Conference official Joe D'Antonio said that that's who the email was from, the NCAA director of academic and membership affairs to Chris Richardson Chris Richardson to Joe D'Antonio. And USA Today reported in July that the NCAA had decided that since it viewed the form not being required, the best solution was to eliminate the form. But some conferences and schools have been requiring athletes to sign name and likeness release forms separate from the NCAA's, and U.S. District Judge Claudia Wilkins ruled in the O'Bannon case the judge's ruling in that case did not fully resolve the issue. She said only that those releases might be unlawful. But really, when it gets down to it, this is about an intellectual property case, right? Of whether or not these athletes own every picture that has ever been taken of them, even when those pictures, be it, in the form of video, are taken while they are playing sports, and they know that the game is going to be televised. They know that the game is going to be broadcast, that their image could possibly wind up being shown in some commercial for, hey, watch the football championship. Here's this guy. And now they're saying, well, we deserve to get compensated. You are being compensated. You're being given a free education. You're being given a free place to stay while you go to school. Like, you are getting a dorm. You are getting an education. Whether or not you decide to waste that education on something that isn't really going to be useful to you after you wind up being done playing sports, that's not the fault of the college. That's on you. But to claim that this is, an antitrust lawsuit, it just seems astronomical to me to claim that it's an antitrust lawsuit when there are multiple television networks that air sports all the time. NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, ESPN, they all have college football games on Sunday or on Saturdays. So I don't really see this as being an antitrust thing. I see it more as an intellectual property where they're trying to claim that they own their own name. And to some extent, I can respect that of, yes, like you do. But at the same time, that what you're getting into is going to be something that, people are going to film, people are going to take pictures of, people are going to broadcast on. It would be akin to me doing this radio show and then filing a lawsuit against everybody listening saying, you can't use anything that I have said in any way to influence your opinion. It's complete BS. I hope the judge throws this case out. This has been Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. And tune in next week, same place, same time, online. In the meantime, FP.